Hello again. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third installment here with GRF. We're going to go through it's the ultimate roadmap for building DCAA compliant indirect rates. I think this could end up being a hot topic of this entire series as we get through some of this government shutdown. Hopefully later this week, there'll probably be a number of claims or REAs going out. So, pay attention here, and hopefully we'll go through some key topics that could be very germane and to that and to everything going forward. So with that said, I'm Cy Alba. I'm a partner with Polaro Mazza in our government contracts group, and I know I've been talking with a number of people on that front about what to do when things reopen. And I know some of my friends here have as well. I'm here with Jennifer and Paul again with GRF, and they're going to walk through some of these key issues. And with that, Jennifer, do you want to introduce yourself and kick things
Sure.
off?
Thank you, Cy. My name's Jennifer Arce. I am a principal at GRF, specializing in outsourced accounting and advisory services. So anything really that touches government contractors, from indirect rate structures, cost plus environments and audits, ERP implementation, and outsourced accounting.
And I'm Paul Calabrese, also a principal in OAAS in GRF. And you could just basically refer to me as a subject matter expert. I used to be a DCAA auditor. I also worked in compliance at GovCons, and now for over 25 years working as a consultant or subject matter expert and trying to help everybody. So we are now in part 3. And all of this is happening because we're in the cost reimbursable world. And in the cost reimbursable world, there's exponential oversight compared to just fixed price and T&M and some of the topics that we're going to discuss. If you remember part 1, we talked about the different types of audits that were initiated possibly. In the second part, we talked about managing those audits. In the third part, you may have an incurred cost audit because you have submitted some indirect rates that you need to have settled because you have cost type contracts. And so we're going to get into some of the nitty gritty details about indirect rates, all those fun things that we want to deal with. And so overall today, we'll talk a little bit about these multi-tiered rates, service centers, overhead, G&A, uniqueness of BMP, and analysis of indirect rates. So we won't address every type of indirect rate. We are focusing more on the service contractor model, but certainly there are other indirect rates that are very important that you should know about. So right now we're going to go on and send it over to Jen.
Yes, so a little bit of overview on what indirect rates are. We use indirect rates to allocate what we considered shared costs across projects to be compliant with the FAR. So typical examples, we would have our fringe expenses, anything that really benefits the employee group as a whole. So that would be your health insurance, your 401k contributions, payroll taxes, etc. Overhead, and contractors can have multiple overheads depending on locations that they are at, specific needs, different offices. That's really anyone covering support on project sides. And then G&A. So G&A is really your general and administrative costs. That would be your back office, your accountants, anything that really is around your Zoom licenses that support the company, anything that really is considered that a support for the entire organization that is allowable per the FAR. When we do talk about these indirect rates, they are FAR Part 31 and the cost accounting standards, and we'll go a little bit more into that. And we really follow these standards just to ensure that the costs are equitable when they are distributed out to different projects. And I know, Cy, you would like to touch a little bit on the allowable cost and payment clause.
Yeah, so I think it's important when we're talking about all these things that the broader rules are all in FAR Part 31, but you might have certain provisions in your contracts, and that's Like for instance, this allowable cost and payment clause at FAR 52. So anything, just generally anything that starts with the 52 is a contract clause. So you'll see those actually in your contract, whereas the other parts of the FAR won't necessarily be there. But irrespective of whether this particular clause is included or not, if you're dealing with a cost reimbursable contract, or in cases where you're seeking remuneration through the claims process, even in a firm fixed price world, it sort of converts things over, or an REA, I should say. It converts things over to essentially a cost reimbursable type contract for purposes of the claim improving your costs. So in either way, this becomes important. And so you have to look at it from the perspective of whether or not the costs you're seeking are actually allowable, meaning they have to be allocable to the contract you're talking about, or like we're talking about here, they're an indirect rate that is allowable that is partially attributed to this contract. And then you've got the idea of them being fair and reasonable as well. So in that context, when you're looking at something, especially now that we have the government likely reopening, there's likely going to be some REAs and claims that are filed by individuals based upon either delays or certain idle equipment costs or idle individuals, like those sorts of things I could see starting to come up. And so you need to look at it and make sure that all of these costs you're talking about are directly allocable. The direct costs are allocable to the contract you're seeking. So you can't spread costs out over different contracts if they're not an indirect rate, which again, we'll get into this entire presentation. But when you're talking about direct costs, it has to be allocable to the specific contract and it has to be reasonable. So you can't get in a situation where, let's say, and I've had this come up a number of times in the past couple of days with folks, if you have a situation where you kept employees on board during the shutdown just to be nice, generally the government looks at that as a business decision or business expense that is not directly recoverable. And so you could have issues there if the contracting officer didn't tell you to keep people around, or if you potentially received some direction, I should say, from the government that you could get turned on at any moment. And I know we were just talking before the webinar kicked off about companies that did have individuals that were asked to come back on a temporary basis, a day here, a day there, or if they were told the second this shutdown lifts, this is critical, I need you back immediately, and next business day, 8 a.m. type of scenario, that could give you an opening to actually get certain idle costs or costs for employees that you were forced to keep on board. But the general rule is that if you got a stop work order, or if there was a shutdown like this and you were told to go home, then in those sorts of cases, the costs of carrying the employees, continuing to pay them, even if they were on PTO, things of that nature, it's generally not recoverable unless you got direction, like I said, that you had to have people on standby, or you could make an argument that if you were told you had to spin up rapidly, there could be a basis there for recovery for those individuals who are working on the contract as a direct costs, and then the portion of the indirect costs that were directly allocable to the contract itself and are fair and reasonable. So you're going to have to be prepared to sort of fight on multiple fronts probably about whether or not you're entitled to it. And even if you are entitled, how much was it? Was it reasonable to keep all the people around, some of the people around? And were the costs in total something that the government determines to be fair and reasonable under the circumstances? So all of that comes down to that allowable cost and payment clause. So it's important to note those things.
Jen?
Perfect. I think next slide, Paul.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
So we touched a little bit in the last slide on this, but the common types of indirect rates that we see for government contractors are the fringe, and that again is your employee benefits, leaves, and payroll taxes. And then a typical base for that would be your direct labor along with your indirect labor. So anything that is overhead, G&A, subcontractor handling, all of that would typically go into the base. Your overhead is your project level support costs. So anything that is attributed to project support. And then a typical base of that would be direct labor or BMP labor along with the fringe allocation for that. Our G&A would be the corporate level administrative costs. And then there are a few different types of G&A bases. So we can have a total cost input, which would be all costs in the organization, excluding the G&A, or value added base. So when we do the value added base, that's really where we get into this next item, which is the material or subcontractor handling. And we'll go quite extensively on this a little bit later in the webinar. And that would be anything procurement, management, oversight, contract related support that goes into its own separate pool. And the typical base for that would be the direct materials or subcontractor costs. So when we do set something up like that, then we go into this value added base for G&A.
Okay. So now we're going to talk about these rates, again, mostly from a service contractor model. So we get into a little bit of the theory behind it, that when we start with any of these indirect costs, and we're talking about fractions, which are numerators and denominators, the most important level, and Sai had also mentioned it, is what's allocable and directly identifiable to a contractor direct cost. And our model will vary from other models. You would probably see, if you saw all different kinds of rates, sometimes fringe can be a part of an overhead and a part of a G&A that they internally allocate through a general ledger account or something. What we're doing here is we're setting up cost pools, we're setting up cost centers, and we're gonna, in this model, which is different, but it gives you a different idea of how things may work for a government contractor, fringe and occupancy are going to be service centers. So in this case, fringe is allocated to direct and indirect labor and via overhead and G&A. Occupancy is allocated to overhead and G&A. And in this case, we're going to use square footage, a little bit different. And overhead generally can be done many different ways, but in this model, direct labor and fringe. And finally, we have G&A that's allocated over what we call a total cost input, which are the levels 1 through 4. And so what happens is now you're getting to see a little bit of this unique DCAA incurred cost electronic ICE submission. And this is one of the versions of that ICE submission. And what you can see here is overhead numerator over denominator, pool over base with a resultant rate. The same with G&A, the same with two service centers, the fringe and the occupancy, where occupancy is the base, the allocation base is square footage. So both of the fringe pool and occupancy pool, we need to have a rate to negotiate, even though the total amounts of those pools will be allocated somewhere else. So that brings us to the first poll, Jen.
Anyone looking for CPE will need to respond to the 3 questions that we have. So go ahead and start with this one. Which of the following best describes the purpose of an indirect rate? We'll give everybody a minute.
And Jen, I won't be able to see the results of the poll, so when it's done, if you could just let me know, please.
Yep, I'll give it just one more. We still have quite a bit of people submitting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end it. So 95% came back and with the correct answer, which is to allocate shared or common costs across multiple projects. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So B is actually the correct answer on that one.
Okay, so now we're going to take a little dive into service centers. And basically the service centers are for fringe in this example and for allocating occupancy costs. And basically on the right is a bunch of fancy dancy words. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to put all, whether it be fringe or occupancy, we're going to put it into a cost center, which may involve a number of general ledger accounts, and we're going to allocate them appropriately to either overhead in this example or G&A. So as was stated before, fringe benefits, generally and usually if it's going to be allocated, it's allocated on what we call productive labor, direct labor, overhead, bid and proposal, independent research and development, which I'll try to call IR&D for simplicity, and G&A. So there is a part of labor that's not productive of what sometimes DCAA refers to. It's the paid absence that's not included. Occupancy is allocated to both G&A and overhead based on the cost center square footage. This issue comes really into being when you have an organization that is in one building and a group of people are doing really G&A function and others doing an overhead function. And we want to kind of break out costs in an allocable way to both places. Human resources, which is not in our example, often or times is allocated on headcount. We'll see that used. So the rate in this case has to be presented as you saw on that first page from the ICE submission, because we need to negotiate it, as it will help us to allocate these costs to other places. And that gets in.
I was going to jump, sorry, back on the last slide. I have seen that human resources typically would end up in the G&A pool just because it's your headcount is ever changing. However, if you do have recruiting and talent acquisition, that could be a reason for a service center, and use maybe your ticket count as the basis to be able to spread across the different overheads, subhandling, and G&A based on the positions that are open that they're actively recruiting for. Also, depending on the need for it, we've seen, network. So if you have if you're heavy on IT costs, being able to accumulate all your IT costs and support into the service center, and then being able to allocate it out based on the end uses. So whether it's project-based into the overheads, based on the number of computers or open tickets. There's quite a few different ways to do that, but just wanted to throw those out there because that is something that we do see quite a bit on the IT government contracting side.
Yeah, and one other on that point too, when you're dealing with IT issues, I do deal with a lot of data rights and IP protection vis-a-vis the federal government. And so another part of this is, even if you have a firm fixed price contract or various firm fixed price contracts, to the extent that you're developing any sort of intellectual property, be it software or any sort of processes, patents, anything like that, products, you want to make sure that you're still tracking all that time, effort, and costs under your IR&D, and not just failing to track it or lumping it together. Because if you're ever forced to prove, if you're trying to restrict the government's rights or limit the government's rights in that intellectual property, even in the commercial context, you're going to have to be able to show that all of that work was done at private expense. And so if you're not tracking it appropriately, that can be extremely difficult, and you could lose your rights or lose the ability to restrict the government's rights in any of that IP, which means you can't sell it to them. And if a lot of, like our clients, a lot of their customers or their main customer, their only customer is the federal government, that can be a major issue. So just make sure you're aware of that and tracking carefully.
Right.
Yeah, and I do see that, especially with the startup of these ideas of getting into it, and then it turns into a product. But at that point, if it's sitting on your rate structure, being able to go back and make any necessary corrections all the way back to the beginning.
Okay. In a fringe benefit service center cost pool, you might see some of these types of expenses, of course, paid absence, vacation, PTO, holiday, sick, There's even something new, unlimited PTO. I'm not going to go into it, but there are newer types of benefits, so-called benefits, payroll taxes, their pension plans, group insurance. It could also be vision care. We've talked a little bit about tuition assistance. Jen may want to mention that. Public transportation.
So the tuition assistance and what we call as the benefit of whether it's tuition reimbursement or maybe they have PMPs and they're getting that covered, really depends on the agencies and the auditors that you're going to get as to how to handle that. So while maybe when you do your provisional rates, you say, hey, I'm going to give everyone a $3,000 allowance. That's the max that they can do. That is our policy. It's for all full-time employees. We have seen a big push back to having those go to their ultimate cost objectives and taken out of the fringe pool. So the government has come back and said, we want to see this if they are direct. We want to see it in the overhead that they belong to. If it's your subcontracts person, we want to see it in the subcontracts pool. And so we've seen this big shift out of a fringe benefit and into an overhead and a G&A expense. Now, I would typically put it into a fringe benefit unless you have received direct guidance from the government. So it really depends on the agency and the audit group that you're going to have.
Okay, and you deal mostly with the civilian agencies, right?
I do, and in fact, depending on where the projects exist now for clients, we are proactively moving those costs out of fringe and over to overhead, sure, subhandling, G&A into those pools.
And another expense that you'll see sometimes, it varies. Some people want to put their bonus. And then I know Jen has different types of bonus, but let's just talk generic bonus for people, incentive compensation. Sometimes I've seen it in fringe. Sometimes I see it allocated either for overhead or G&A. Some people put it in G&A because it's volatile. It can be great or small amount year by year. And Jen, you have other types of incentives, right? Where they're
yeah, so typically what I see that goes through the fringe on is your referral bonuses. If you have and I want to say you have to have a bonus policy, right? So for any of this to be allowable, we need to have very clear defined bonus policies. So referral bonus, you can have a spot bonus as long as you have a spot bonus policy. Then if it's more performance based, so that would be people who have actual incentive plans based on certain metrics, we do typically see that go into the overheads, especially if their performances are helping out with certain contracts. And then the G&A comes down to, a management type bonuses.
Okay, great. So let's move on. Now we're getting more into this unique ICE model where they got all these funny little colors. They got the yellow for inputs and these aqua type colors for the amounts that have maybe a formula or something. But generally you saw the same items I listed, and now you see it. They do want to see the general ledger account, the description, and then it starts with the general ledger in this column, and then adjustments would be any unallowable expenses, and finally the claimed amounts for a grand total of 208. I don't want to focus too much, and I realize as we're going through this and we're talking a lot more about policy and concept, which is probably the most important thing to leave you with. This is could be a frightening schedule, basically showing how the base, the denominator, is allocated out here. And you see this total amount down here that I put here is 779,000. These are just the totals of all the different types of labor here. And so what we're doing is we're trying to get a percent of like 90,000 here of 779,000 is 1154. You multiply that times this piece, and you're going to get an amount that's going to be allocated. This is the mystery behind it, how they allocate fringe for G&A labor or these other types of labors to G&A itself. So that's probably all I'd want to share about this. Again, there will be these types of computations to show you the reality of how it works in this schedule. Okay, let's move on. Oh, another number here. Okay, here is occupancy pool. And again, I tried to make it somewhat simple, but basically on this side is the types of things: rent, insurance, property taxes, permit, licenses. The insurance might be would be related to property and liability. Permit, license, depreciation, amortization, repairs, and maintenance. Notice here there's no person, there's no facility manager. If there was a facility manager, then there would be some fringe allocated to it. And we'll talk a little bit more how these are set up later. But basically down here on the side is what we're showing is the amount of square footage. And the relationship with G&A is it's about 13%, and overhead is 87, which would be typical. Remember, they're going to be in the same building, and you're going to have the overhead's going to include direct personnel as well as the indirect overhead personnel. So it's going to be, that's why it would tend to be larger. And then we get amounts based on these percentages times 154 either place. And we're going to allocate 20,000 to G&A and 134,000 to overhead. And you can see there are a lot of expenses here. It's kind of hard. How do we break these things out? In this case, it was square footage. Other organizations have used labor. Okay, just want to, now we're going to go on to overhead. And overhead is a special area because people have a question and saying, and this is the biggest question, and certainly Jen is free to chime in when I just finish in a minute, but what is the difference between overhead and G&A? And that gets a lot of people concerned and so forth. But overhead, if you think about it, really manages smaller segments of the organization. Smaller segments that could be business lines or types of contractual service. Could be like it's a logistics group, or this group over here deals more with IT to the government as the client. And another thing you may want to note is that the government, at least from DCAA, Defense Contract Audits Agency's perspective, you can very well have it mixed with commercial. This notion of taking one that's totally commercial and one that's government, and they have to be separate. They don't have to be separate. You may, for a reason, separate them. But the government likes it when they're together because they know that the burden on commercial services is so much less than all the compliance requirements. But it's just a thought as I was talking to mention to you. Manufacturing, engineering, on-site means generally on government sites, so then you wouldn't have to worry about facility type costs. And off-site would be, again, at your site. Geographic rates, where like if you have a group of people nestled down in Norfolk, you know that those people are going to be probably paid less than those in the Washington, D.C. area. So an overhead pool would consist of a vice president or a department head or someone running a business line and needing other people to manage it. Would you like to mention anything, Jen, on this?
The only thing if you do end up having multiple overheads and obviously for us, the next would be offsite. So if you have an office space that is very maybe contract driven, but it's not a direct cost to the contract, we don't really ever want to be in a position where your offsite rate is lower than your onsite rate. And it seems like that would be user intuitive, but get in there. Sometimes we look at incurred cost submissions and we see, an on-site rate of 15% and an off-site rate of 6%. And then obviously the government's going to come back and say, what's going on here? Your on-site, especially since your folks are working at the government site, should typically be the lower of the overhead rates.
So if you saw the situation, would you just think they combine it and have one overhead rate? Or how would you look at that?
I think it's really dependent on why they have another overhead set up. And, some of this goes back to what is overhead, what is G&A.
Sure.
I'm a firm believer of it depends on the business reason as to why we're allocating and what how much can you defend the argument of putting something in that could be one or could be the other? It really goes back to the argument that you have of why you're classifying it one way or another. I don't know, Sai, if you want to chime in on that from a legal perspective, but we typically would suggest that they have a very well documented reason as to why it's going into overhead versus G&A.
Yeah, that tends to be what I've seen as well. Is it's not really well defined from a legal perspective, and so what they tend to look at is how the company has treated things in the past to make sure it's been consistent. And if you're changing anything, especially if it's like a large contract, in fact, I've had some false claim cases where folks had moved things and treated things in different ways for large contracts versus smaller contracts in order to sort of shift costs, or even if they've allocated things to different CLINs. So if you have like a larger CLIN and you're trying to spend more on that CLIN and you're allocating costs to contracts that have these larger CLINs, like you could get into trouble if somebody were to look at it and you haven't treated it consistently the entire time. So just be very careful of that, so that you don't get in trouble with an audit, because it can spin out of control if it's really bad, or you just get someone who's incredibly aggressive and refers it over to the Department of Justice. The other thing I just wanted to note is that, and I guess you guys can talk about where this might go specifically, but when you're talking about taxes and things, I just wanted to, because I saw that we were talking about that a couple slides ago, this interesting issue of the tariffs and what could happen with the tariffs if the Supreme Court rules the tariffs were unconstitutional and they require reimbursement. To the extent that you get reimbursed, and I know it's the government reimbursing you for tariffs that you may or may not have paid on certain, say, material costs, or that someone else charged you, and if they're getting a refund, you should try to get the refund from your supplier, or if you bought it directly and you get a refund, even though it's coming from the government, the other side of the government is likely going to ask for a refund of that. So you get paid from one side of the government, and you might have to pay back the other side of the government, meaning the agency that you're working with, because of the fact that a lot cost reimbursable contracts are generally subject to the refund clauses in the FAR. So to the extent that you get some sort of refund, you're probably going to owe that back to the government. So be careful with how you're tracking that as well, and not sort of spending some of this refund money, because it does look like, from everything I've read, that the Supreme Court's going to rule these are unconstitutional, and there will be some refunds if you're in that kind of scenario. So I just want to note that as well.
Okay. So again, going to the ICE presentation of overhead, one account that's not up there that should have been was overhead labor. When I did this many eons ago, it was excluded inadvertently. But basically, you can see the expense accounts, and often there are a number of them. And it's from the account number, the description, from general ledger, and then adjustments or unallowable costs to claim costs. And it just keeps going down, down, down. There's a lot of things that a typical overhead might have. And then you see some cost inputs. These are the allocations of occupancy that we did before, and an allocation of fringe benefits on overhead. And then some of the descriptions of the overhead items, unallowable, are there. When I set up for my clients, the overhead and indirect and G&A structures, I tend to have the unallowables, I try to orient them more to G&A, or even have a separate structure of, these are 7,000, 8,000 general ledger or G&A. They don't always have to be, of course, and 9,000 are unallowables. But a lot of these unallowables, sometimes they may be applicable to an overhead. They get a little bit more complicated, because what you're seeing here is you're seeing at the bottom 532,000 total overhead, but less the unallowables. It's about 500,000, and it gets into a lot of little other types of issues as we go on. Let's see, there may be even a little red thing here. And then we go on to the allocation base. And so you might ask this question, and I was thinking about it as I was preparing. Contract labor is direct labor. So direct labor definitely is typically and usually the allocation base for overhead. And then there are add-ons like fringe benefits on the direct labor. And you might begin to say, well, why is independent research and development, or IR&D and bid and proposal, B&B, in here as well? Typically, for government contractors, the technical folks are either going to be somewhat direct labor. They could wear many hats. They could charge overhead indirect labor as they're managing an overhead group or participating or doing some indirect purpose. And they're going to also be charging, and in this case, let's try to make it a little bit simpler, bid and proposal. So the technical people would charge bid and proposal, and that is why you're seeing, or independent research and development, that's why you're seeing labor in their labor, and then the associated fringe. This is really a total number, but the fringe applies to both direct labor, IR&D, and B&P labor. And then all of that becomes a part of the base. So you can see that the total rate would have been almost 64%. When you remove the unallowables, it's down to 60%. So we are going to move into a poll for Jen.
Yes. Again, anyone needing CPE, please go ahead and respond. Which regulatory body primarily audits contractor indirect rate structures for compliance? So I think we had about 90 people last time. So once I see the numbers slow down a little bit, we will close the poll. I'll give it about 10 more seconds. Yes, 98% of you guys responded with the correct answer of the Defense Contract Audit Agency.
All right. So general and administrative, certainly these are costs that benefit the organization as a whole. You're thinking of your executive suite, HR, IT, legal, if you're large enough. And then again, what we're going to see is that some of the allocation of costs for occupancy and fringe will go there. So again, from my perspective, the way I see the difference between G&A and overhead is overhead are managing smaller segments, more related, project related kind of efforts, whereas G&A is an overall indirect benefiting the organization as a whole. Okay.
The one thing,
the
one thing I was going to point out to this with legal is that while legal is typically an allowable expense, you have to really watch, because any legal expenses for protests is explicitly an unallowable cost. And then as we get into the subcontractor cost pool, if you do have legal expenses tied to contracts and or subcontracts, that would be excluded out of the G&A pool.
Okay.
Yeah, it's actually any cost for litigation against the government. So claims, any of that stuff. Whereas REA costs or costs to negotiate, legal costs to negotiate or be in compliance are allowable. And the kind of wrinkle there is if you're in a protest and let's say you've won a contract and you're intervening and the government expressly requests that you intervene, you can recover those costs as well, or those costs can become allowable because they've been requested. Your presence or your assistance has been requested by the government if you have that in writing. So to the extent that you are looking to intervene, that can be a good thing, because I've had cases where the government was quite unprepared or their lawyers were inexperienced, and that's probably going to increase, frankly, because of everything that's occurred. And the government asked us to take a unorthodox role in the protest, assisting them with a heavy hand and spending a lot of our time to help them do what would otherwise be their work. And in that particular instance, it was an allowable cost because of the request from the government. So there are definitely wrinkles in that.
Okay. So I just want to go over again for the allocation base, we call it a total cost input base. The standard G&A allocation base would be direct labor, fringe applied to direct labor, overhead applied to direct labor and fringe, other direct costs, and finally G&A. So it's just a little simple model until we get into this misery. So there's a little bit more you can see here with the G&A cost pool, the numerator. And again, you have a litany of expenses. The only difference I would have done, this came, I think, from the standard demo of the ICE model that DCAA prepares. They have one that's blank and they have one that puts in numbers. And, you know, I wouldn't put the unallowables with the allowables. Of course, there's some partially allowable, partially unallowable. This is the unallowable and this is the allowable. And you can, when you have time, you can go over some of the notes as far as why they're unallowable. But you can see even in a G&A pool, there's a lot of complexity. But I focus you again that there are cost inputs for occupancy and cost inputs for the fringe allocation that relates to the G&A labor. And then, if you think about it, there's independent research and development below B&P. We'll talk a little bit more why they wind up in the G&A pool. Since I have a slide that explains a little bit more about that, I'd prefer to hold off. But you can see that independent research and development has an other direct or materials or ODC type component, has labor. It pools because you have labor. It's then going to pull an allocable portion of fringe and an allocable portion of occupancy, and so does B&P. It does the same thing. They both function the same way. And we'll get a little bit more into the theory. And then you can see the total amount of IR&D, B&P, and G&A expense. Well, actually, if you think about this, I know this may sound weird, but it's a service center too. In a sense, it is costs that are grouped together, and then it's government decided in most cases that IR&D and B&P should be allocated through the total cost input base or whatever base that you have. And oh boy, here comes even the fun part. And perhaps that's why we won't do too much in numbers. We didn't want it to be totally a numbers game. But when you break up the denominator, the total cost input base for a G&A base, the first thing, when it says contract labor, contract travel, it's all direct costs, direct labor, travel, material, in this case, other direct costs and subcontracts. In this example, you got 2.6 million. And then what you have is a piece where you have the overhead. And notice that the overhead is not the allowable overhead of 499,000, it's total overhead. And so there are funky little things that the federal government tried to put in there. And they basically say if something is unallowable and it's in the denominator, it stays in the denominator and it receives its allocable portion of the associated G&A costs. So that in the fringe base, and this is the fringe for both direct labor, the allocable portions of fringe for B&P and R&D, and then below, what we got to do is remove those pieces out and put them with B&P in the numerator of G&A, and that's effectively what's happening for overhead. I don't want to spend a whole total time on it because it could give you a headache, but it is actually the math of what's going on with this process. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
Yes, so I wanted to talk a little bit about subcontractor and material handling pools because I feel like this is the best kept secret for government contractors, especially for small to mid-sized businesses. But with that, let's do our final third polling question. And why might a company establish a separate subcontractor handling pool? And we'll give that. So this is like the first question we're seeing quite a bit of mixed responses on. So we'll give it just a few more minutes, seconds.
Was this a trick question?
I guess so.
People view it differently. Maybe they're possible answers, a couple.
So it looks a little stable now. So 58% selected C, which is to prevent distortion of G&A rates when subcontract dollars are high. And the reason that I did want to go into this, if you want to go to the next slide, Paul,
Yes,
is that what I see, especially when we go into these small and mid-sized government contractors, is that they've been very dependent on 1099s and subcontractors to perform quite a bit of the work. And the first question that gets asked to me is, we bid our rates based on X wrap rate. We're performing at X wrap rate, and why are we not making money? Well, we're not making money typically because our wrap rate is low based on the amount of subcontractors that they are using. So when we do have a high dollar value of subcontractors and 1099s, with what Paul explained, that they end up in the base of the G&A pool, it artificially decreases that G&A rate. So,
Sure.
where they're thinking our G&A rate is 9%, we're actually at like 17, 18, 19% when we start moving those subcontractor costs out. And in turn, then obviously that is why we are not making the margins that we thought we were making, is because we're actually using a very low wrap rate. So when we talk about the subcontractors, it really does create this inequitable cost allocation because we have such a small administrative burden within that G&A pool, but then by allocation of putting the subcontractor dollars in, that G&A base just explodes. And when we have a high base and a lower pool, obviously our rate is going to be a lot lower. So when we do set up this this other pool for subcontractor handling, and we start moving pool costs out as well. So when we talk about the pool, we think of maybe legal expenses around subcontract administration, your subcontract administration labor. We have, if you have cobblestone, your contract management system. If you are heavy on subcontractors, putting time into your accounting system, allocating the cost of those licenses out into that pool out of G&A. That can all go into the pool. And then obviously we have the base being the subcontractors and your 1099s. And typically what ends up is you could have a 1, 2, 3% sub handling pool. And then by the removal of those costs out of your G&A, we get to a closer actual representation of what your G&A expense might be. Next one, Paul. So, I see a lot of contractors that come in and say, well, I'm too small for a sub handling pool. And I don't think the size of your company really determines whether or not a sub handling pool is necessary. It's really based on the total cost of how your company is running and how much of this, how dependent you are on utilizing subcontractors and consultants in order to get the work done. So when we start looking at the subcontractors as a percentage of your total base, and if you're 20, 30, 40%, it could be cause to go ahead and pull those costs out and setting up this sub handling pool. When we don't have this, we can have DCAA, DCMA, or even some of the contracting officers raising concerns about equitable allocation. We do see that, especially if you are bidding and maybe trying to get lowest price available, and you're having a total cost input and you have all your subs in there, and then the government could get really antsy about, well, if you bid and said my G&A rate is 8%, and then they look and see that subcontractors are 50% of your base of G&A, they could go, oh my gosh, what happens if you pull them out and now you try to come back at me for cost, right? And now your G&A explodes to 19%, maybe not that year, but if it's a 4-year contract and things change and you set up this pool, you could potentially have quite a bit of money due back to you from the government that they were not expecting. So by setting this up, it helps really get that true G&A rate, and then obviously the double cost accounting between the G&A within the handling pools. So some of the key takeaways for the sub-handlings is just making sure that you are doing fair cost allocations to all of your indirect pools and direct projects based on FAR and CAS. I do believe that the biggest thing is that it prevents that distortion of the G&A rates. 4 out of 5 clients that I go into, when we look at their G&A base, they think they're doing fantastic because their G&A rate is low, but 70% of their base is made up of subhandling subcontractors. And so when we pull that out, they're typically astounded at the fact that their G&A rates are high 20s, if not low 30%. And obviously that eats away at any profit into the business by having such a high G&A rate of what it's actually costing them to run the company. Obviously, we want to make sure that any documentation and the consistency is key. So what you don't want to do is flip-flop between, I have a subhandling pool this year, I don't have a subhandling pool next year. The government looks year over year, as we talked about in the previous slides, especially with incurred cost submissions. So if you have submitted incurred cost submissions and now we are saying, okay, we're at the point where we're going to set up this subhandling pool, that would be something that you would want to disclose on the schedules for accounting changes and indirect rate changes for how within your next year. Obviously, we would want to put that on your provisional rates as well. And then, talk to your finance and contracts departments earlier on as you start bringing in more and more subcontractors to see if we really should go ahead and start a rate development for setting up a subhandling pool.
Okay. All right. So I just want to talk briefly about the uniqueness of bid and proposal and independent research and development. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because I can see our time is short. But basically, there's a cost accounting standard 420, and that's why they treat BMP or IR&D as a direct cost, and it receives its allocated proportion. In this example, fringe and occupancy and overhead, if occupancy was involved. Well, occupancy and fringe would be in the overhead. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And independent research and development are done the same way. Normally, according to cost accounting standards, you're supposed to set up projects or program numbers and tracking for both. A lot of small firms that are not CAS covered don't do that. And sometimes the people in G&A that work on the financial part of the proposals, they'll just charge G&A. So you'll see a variety of different approaches. I just wanted to briefly mention there is something called direct selling. There are many different types of general selling costs. Bid and proposals, unique type, but you probably have business development type costs, and it probably comes under direct selling, which is characterized as person-to-person contract, and it is contact, and it is allowable, and it's familiarizing your potential customer with your services, conditions, negotiation, liaison, and so forth, even individual demonstrations or even in past capability brochures. So a lot of people think that this is marketing or something that's unallowable, but really it is allowable. The government has the problem with the public relations or the general advertising because you pump a lot in it. There's no visible, measurable direct benefit, but with direct selling, it is, and it is allowable. So look at your marketing costs or BD and see whether you're possibly characterizing it properly. Because we're limited in a time, the only thing I wanted to show you about percent of base analysis and analyzing some of these rates is sometimes, and the government does it too, they look at flux analysis, between an account between like 1,500 and 2,500 in medical. This is just a very simple example. But DCAA, when I was with DCAA, we learned that to also analyze the reason why this also went up, it went up 1,000, but the reason the percent went up is because 2,500 as a percent of 7,500, the base shrunk. And so a lot of times people are not analyzing the rates and they're not figuring out why rates or percentages of expenses from year to year are going up. It could be a change in your denominator. The last thing, which I would expect most of you would be experts, your
Can I jump in on that one really quick? Sorry, Paul.
Okay. All right.
When we look at this from an incurred cost submission, especially on the NIH side, as well as a provisional rate, I always tell my clients for every single account, we look at this flux analysis year over year, because it's almost guaranteed that the auditors are going to come back and ask us. So especially in the provisional rate documents, when we submit this, we will go find anything that's greater than 20%, and we put very vague notations in the file itself as to why it is. So maybe medical premiums increased by 10%, because in this situation, especially, they're going to look at it and say, your labor dropped, but your medical expenses raised. Why is it? So go ahead and giving them a little bit up front can actually save you a whole lot of sample documentation on the back end. So just being able to be cognizant of that and running, you know, we do it on a quarterly basis for a lot of our clients, is the flux analysis. It also helps be able to determine if something is miscoded ahead of time. But if you're constantly looking at it on a quarterly basis, it should be fairly easy to be able to explain back to the government.
Great. The last thing, which again, I believe most people are familiar with the multiplier, is the wrap rates. In this example, fringe is 35%, overhead 25%, and G&A 12%. If you do this formula, you're saying 1.89. That factor, what that means, for every dollar spent, you need additional cost of 89 cents per dollar in burden cost. So those are important things. I know some people look at these multipliers and say, at least from my experience, is, you know, 2 is kind of average, 1.5 or 6 is really bare bones as far as, and this is before profit. And as you start to get over to maybe, you know, you're higher, a little bit less competitive, unless you're in a unique sole source kind of environment. I don't know if, Jen, you want to say something about it? I'm sure you deal with multipliers all the time.
Yeah, and this is really where, you know, a lot of my clients depend on that overhead, or I'm sorry, that multiplier to be able to schedule out what their pricing is. And so if you are sitting here and in this instance saying my G&A is 12%, however, we start excluding those subcontractor costs and that goes up to 25%, you'll see that 1.89 very quickly turned into like a 2.1, 2.2 wrap rate. And so when we look at the final P&L, they're like, I don't understand why I'm not making money. And it's because instead of costing 89 cents for every dollar, it's really actually costing them like $1.10 or, you know, instead for every dollar. And so they're overspending on the back office because they've underpriced how they're actually operating. So some of that is strategic on whether or not they want to be aggressive to win the work, and that's a business decision. But I stress to be able to look at it so that you know, am I making a strategic business decision to win it, or am I clueless on what my actual wrap rate is and I'm losing money in the process? And so that's something that it's never too early to start looking at.
So I guess the moral of the story is, especially some of you who are fixed price time and material, I hope you really have models or, you know, the ICE model or something like it, that you're developing these rates, at least on a historical basis at year end, and doing some basic projections at the feed into these wrap rates. And Jen has some great software that deals with that too, to make it a little bit easier. We're coming to the end as far as takeaways. And there are many takeaways. Obviously, the multipliers, you know, depending on how they're set up, drive the direct cost. There is a situation where someone comes out of Lockheed Martin, they're now starting their own business, and they're saying, hey, you know, they sold me at 150 an hour, so I'll sell myself 150 hours, but the real actual costs are much less. And so there's this challenge. If the government starts asking questions, what's the detail? You know, where do you go? Obviously, your goal is to get full cost recovery, to get all the cost buildup you can. I still believe, maybe people disagree, that the DCAA ICE submission model that we've shown you little pictures of is a reliable model that will help you consistently come up with the best rate. We talked about direct selling expense. You know, indirect rates, generally, the way they're set up, you're only doing it for one legal entity. I've seen some people, they do these rolling rates from February to February when they have a 12/31 year end. And they're really meaningless because the government only respects what they call cost accounting period, which is if it's 12/31, that's your rate. And then the other thing, the final thing is be careful. Don't try to go with a 3-tiered rate or fringe over in G&A if you're very simplistic. Maybe you have fringe and G&A, maybe just have one rate. And I'll leave it up to Janet or Cy if they have final comments.
Yeah, I think I'll just kind of say too that make sure, especially with a lot of the RIFs and the new people coming into the government, new contracting officers, corps, specialists, whatever, make sure that you're prepared also to explain these concepts to them, because all too often I see some contracting officials inside the government believe that all this is just another word for profit. And it's not. Like your overhead, your G&A, these are actual costs, right? So if they start negotiating these things down or refuse to pay, it's not going to be a reduction in profit. You're probably losing money, to the point that Jen was just making earlier, right? And so you need to be prepared to fight for these things or explain these concepts to them so they fully understand it. That's just one thing of key note, I think.
Jen?
No, yeah, that was kind of what he said. Everything I said.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Hope everyone enjoyed it, and this will be posted. And thanks for coming.
And we'll get back to any questions that have not been answered. We'll compile the questions and send out emails within the next few days.
Yes. Thank you.
Exactly.